Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What the Forensics. My name is Nicole, and like always, I am joined by the lovely Rebecca and Journey. This week, Journey will be telling us all about the case of the Oklahoma City bombings, and then we will have the pleasure of hearing Rebecca educate us on the topic of domestic terrorism and how, the bombings and this topic coincide and play a role together. For this episode, I would also like to note that there is a listener's discretion advised, as there are detailed descriptions of mass death. And on that high note, Journey, would you like to delve into the city bombings and tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, of course. All right. So the Oklahoma City bombing is kind of interesting. I'm going to go through what the bombing was and then go into who the bomber was and then how they solved it, and then have a little bit of extra information at the end. So on April 19th, 1995, at 9:02 a.m., a bomb exploded in front of the Alfred P. Mira Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. Moments after the bomb went off, the area looked like it was a war zone. Only 2/3 of the building was left. The third that was destroyed had been turned completely to rubble. Dozens of cars were burned, and more than 300 nearby buildings had been damaged and or destroyed. So it was a giant explosion. This attack rocked the city, not only because of the devastating impacts of the explosion, but also because of the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, just 2 years earlier. I didn't know that there was an earlier attack on the World Trade Center, prior to 9/11.
I didn't either.
Yeah. So that was really interesting to learn because I thought it was a mess up in the article. And when I was reading it, I was like, what the heck? That's super weird. So the World Trade Center bombing was the work of Middle Eastern terrorists. So this 1995 bombing was immediately attributed to the Middle East as well. Just some friendly neighborhood racial profiling over here. So something that is very interesting to me is that they identified the terrorists in the 1993 attack the exact same way that they identified the terrorists in this 1995 attack. And so in both cases, investigators found the axle of a truck in the rubble that had the VIN number on it, and they were able to trace it back to the rental agency or the renter to get the name of the man who rented the truck. In both separate bombings, 2 years apart, I was shocked.
Is that a common thing that happens? Was this axle part of the bomb, or was this axle? Sorry, I missed that part of the rubble.
So the vehicle was the bomb. They filled the vehicle with explosives in both cases, I guess. And so then when it exploded, they were able to find the axle, the rear axle of this truck or van, and find the VIN number on it, and then solve the case so fast, which is weird.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was a bit suspicious because I was switching between the two sites, and I couldn't tell which one I was on when I was reading the section of how they solved these cases because of how similar they were, which was really, really weird. So I kind of went down a little conspiracy loophole with that. So the VIN number, like I said, was traced back to a body shop in Junction City, Kansas, and the employees were able to give a description of the man who had rented the vehicle in the 1995 bombing. A composite sketch was drawn and shown around town and at local hotels, and they were eventually able to get the name Timothy McVeigh. Why they didn't just have the name of the guy who rented the van on hand, I don't know. But that's besides the point. So Timothy McVeigh was born August 23rd, 1968 in Pendleton, New York. He was the second of 3 children and has expressed an interest in guns from a very early age. His grandfather introduced him to guns, which inspired him to want to be a gun shop owner, and he would even bring a gun to school to show the other boys, just as show and tell, which is a giant red flag.
Yeah, I would take that as a massive red flag. Did the schools do anything with that?
Not that I was able to find.
Okay.
So, yeah, take that as you
Classic.
will.
Yep.
He never like shot anyone or never had any like malicious intent with it, but he would just bring them to be like, oh, look at how cool this gun is. But it's still a massive issue that he was bringing weapons to a school. And so his parents divorced when he was 10, and he lived with his father from then on. And by the time McVeigh was 14, he had begun stockpiling food and camping equipment so that he was prepared if a nuclear attack ever occurred or the government became communist. He graduated high school in June 1986, and then started a 2-year computer program at a local college, but he didn't end up finishing it. He then worked a series of odd jobs for the next couple years, and his paranoia of the government grew during this time, and he became increasingly concerned with the Second Amendment after reading The Turner Diaries, which is written by William Pierce. And so this book is an anti-government neo-Nazi tale of genocide against racial minorities that is set in a near-future America. And it also includes details about the truck bombing of the headquarters of the FBI in Washington, D.C. I don't remember what year that took place, but it kind of gave him the idea for his attack in 1995. And in 1988, McVeigh enlisted in the Army, and he was a model soldier and was promoted to sergeant before 1990. So within 2 years, he was promoted to sergeant. He also earned a Bronze Star for bravery in the Persian Gulf War. He then tried out for Special Forces, but dropped out of the program after 2 days. His experience with the Special Forces and this tryout experience really changed his opinion of the military. And so he took an early discharge and left the Army in December 1991.
So sorry, this is a little off topic, but also on topic from last episode. So McVeigh and Snowden would have been just a few years apart in the Special Forces training. And also, I guess they got very different messages out of the Army, because whereas Snowden wanted to keep helping but couldn't,
Yeah.
McVeigh seems very opposite.
That's so cool. I didn't even put that together. Okay, that's really cool. So after he was honorably discharged from the Army, he then returned to upstate New York following that and was unable to find steady work. He experienced very serious bouts of depression and began sharing increasingly angry views of U.S. foreign policy, gun control, and conspiracies within the United Nations. He had reunited with two of his Army buddies, Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier. I apologize if I pronounced his last name wrong. And they also shared his conservative and paranoid political views. And then in March 1992, he wrote a letter to the Lockport Union Sun saying, quote, "America is in decline. Do we have to shed blood to reform the current system?" End quote. Which makes sense. I feel like that statement still applies. I don't know what was in between those two statements that kind of held a little bit more paranoid and conservative view. But apparently he also wrote many letters to different newspapers and media outlets along this, like expressing the same kind of views. And so the Ruby Ridge shootout happened in August 1992. And this had McVeigh thinking more seriously about taking violent action against the government. This was kind of his catalyst. And then in 1993, McVeigh traveled to Waco to observe the ongoing siege of the Branch Davidian compound. And then during the siege, he distributed like pro-gun rights literature and sold bumper stickers. I don't know what the bumper stickers say. I was trying to figure out what kind of bumper sticker you would sell there, but I couldn't. But unsurprisingly, he viewed what was happening at Waco as illegal, and he even told a reporter, quote, "The government is afraid of the guns people have because they have to have control of the people at all times. Once you take away the guns, you can do anything to the people. The government is continually growing bigger and more powerful, and the people need to prepare to defend themselves against government control." End quote. This is an age-old argument that we are still dealing with today. And the Waco siege convinced McVeigh that it was time to start taking action, and his buddy Terry Nichols taught him how to make bombs out of readily available materials at his family farm. I'm unsure how Terry Nichols knew how to make bombs to begin with. They were both in the Army together, so I don't know if that was a skill that he had picked up there or it was just something that he knew. And then in 1994, the U.S. government imposed new firearms restrictions that had McVeigh starting to plan the attack on the Alfred P. Mira Federal Building in September, or by September of 1994. So over the next 6 months, McVeigh and Nichols planned the bombing and acquired the materials through theft and lawful purchase, which is kind of fun. And they used several tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer combined with fuel oil to make the bomb. McVeigh then decided on the date of April 19th, 1995 to bomb the federal building because that was the 2-year anniversary of the Waco disaster, which he was very passionate about. And then on April 16th, 1995, McVeigh and Nichols drove to Oklahoma to stash a getaway car. 2 days later, Nichols helped load the rental van with over 5,000 pounds of explosives that they had assembled in a storage unit in Kansas. I don't know how many pounds of explosives are is a regular amount, but 5,000 pounds seems like way too much. That's so much explosives.
I feel like that's more than you would ever need ever to do anything explosive-wise.
Right? 5 tons of explosive. That's insane.
And they were just hanging around with that.
Yeah, they just assembled it in a storage unit in Kansas, and they were just yep, this is an acceptable amount.
What if in a storage unit they were just with okay, I'm what if you're lighting up a cigarette, something goes wrong,
right?
You're not ending well.
Yeah, okay. I feel like you'd have to be very careful, especially because you're putting it all together the day before, but whatever. Yeah. And so Nichols didn't want to help on the day of the actual explosion. So on the 19th of April, he was at home with his family in Carrington, Kansas, and he spent the next couple days spreading the leftover fertilizer in his yard to get rid of the evidence. So the fact that they had leftover fertilizer after 5,000 pounds of explosives is insane. And then around 9 a.m., April 19th, 1995, McVeigh parked the van in front of the building and lit a timed fuse. At 9:02 a.m., it exploded. So he just kind of lit it and then booked it as fast and as far as he could in those 2 minutes. Around 168 people were killed and several hundred more were injured because 300 buildings within the vicinity were affected. An hour later, McVeigh was pulled over in his getaway car for a license plate violation. And from what I could find, he just didn't have a license plate on this vehicle. So I don't know why you would do that. McVeigh was then arrested after the officer discovered he was illegally carrying a concealed handgun. And while he was in custody, he was identified as the primary suspect in the bombing. Investigators had found traces of the chemicals used on his clothes and a business card that McVeigh had written on the back, quote, TNT at $5 a stick, need more, end quote. Why you would carry that on your person, I don't know.
Love that.
Right?
$5 a stick. What more could you want?
Exactly. So they then learned about his extremist ideologies and anger over the events that happened at Waco 2 years prior. Terry Nichols turned himself in to authorities on April 21st as a material witness. And 2 hours into his questioning, a warrant was issued for Nichols' arrest, but he was questioned for more than 7 hours before he was actually arrested for his connection with the bombing. So he was questioned for 9 hours and then was arrested. And his house was searched and investigators found blasting caps, guns, and a receipt for an insane amount of ammonium nitrate. Again, why you would keep that. So On August 10th, 1995, McVeigh and Nichols were indicted on 11 federal counts, including conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, use of a weapon of mass destruction, destruction by explosives, and 8 counts of first-degree murder. So these 8 counts are for the deaths of the federal officers in the building. They couldn't charge for the other 161 deaths within the federal court because those deaths fell under the state of Oklahoma. So they'd have to wait until this trial finished and then have a separate trial and charges for those 168 deaths, which I don't fully understand, but that's how it went. So in October of 1995, the prosecution announced that they will be seeking the death penalty. McVeigh's trial didn't begin until April 1997. And then on June 2nd, 1997, McVeigh was found guilty on all 11 counts. 11 days later, the jury sentenced McVeigh to death. So his trial was quite short once it actually started. And then in a little bit here, I'll tell you about the actual evidence that they had for this trial, which is shocking that it was so short. And so 3 months later, Terry Nichols was also found guilty of conspiracy and 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And the only reason he was spared the death penalty was because the jury was deadlocked. So they couldn't give the death penalty if the jury couldn't all agree. And he was actually held in the same prison that held the Unabomber. And I would be really interested to see if they ever had any conversations or ever met each other, because I feel like their conversations would be very interesting. And so McVeigh's execution was delayed pending an appeal, but the appeal was denied in 1999. And apparently he had maintained an upbeat attitude up to his execution and said that even after his execution, the score would still be, quote, 168-1, end quote. And so he was still the winner, which is disgusting and heartbreaking to read and hear. And he said that his only regret was not leveling the building completely, which, again, absolutely insane. And he also claimed that the bombing was revenge for what the U.S. government did at Waco and Ruby Ridge. And he knew that he was probably going to be caught and executed. And so he referred to the bombing as state-assisted suicide, which bonkers to have that level of forethought and just acceptance of the consequences of your actions and be willing to die for that cause is just rather insane. And so on June 11th, 2001, at 7:14 a.m., Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection in the United States Federal Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He did not have any last words, but his last statement was William Ernest Henley's poem Invictus, which I'll read in a second. And his last meal, do you guys want to guess what his last meal was if you haven't read the slide?
Chicken fingers and fries.
Mm-mm.
I don't know.
It was 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream.
What?
Right?
What? As his last meal.
Uh-huh.
Not even that after his last meal for a dessert. That was his
the
meal.
last meal.
Was he lactose intolerant? Was this his way of trying to go before the courts took him?
I don't think so.
Just shitting himself with mint chip ice cream? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'm mint chocolate chip ice cream is delicious, but it's definitely not last meal delicious.
No, but not 2 pints of it either.
That's so I can't even imagine eating that much.
Was it I don't know if all mint chip ice cream is like this, but is it with the lime green bright mint chip ice cream? The Chapman's,
so.
Or I don't know what kind of mint chip exists out there, but oh my gosh.
I would imagine that's yeah. Yeah, food for thought. So McVeigh was the first federal prisoner to be executed since 1963, and his remains were cremated and given to his lawyer, who spread them in an undisclosed location. And apparently he had wanted to donate his organs, but he was denied due to prison regulations, which
That really surprises me. I would have thought prisons, like, as long as their bodies were healthy, would be more open and arguably, like, I feel like almost they would make their prisoners do it.
Right? Like,
You know what I mean? Because, I mean,
especially,
they use them for modern day slavery.
yeah.
Why wouldn't they go so far as to do that? I'm not promoting it. I'm just, I feel like they've done worse things.
Well, it didn't make sense to me either.
I feel like I wouldn't want the organ of a killer, though. I mean, I guess you don't know the organ you're getting and who it belonged to, but like
Yeah.
that sense of like in the system, I could be getting the heart or liver of someone that killed hundreds of people.
Yeah. So I think that's probably the reason is like no
more of
one's
a
going to
moral,
want that, even though you
ethical,
shouldn't know your donor. But I
Yeah.
also wonder if there's anything to do with like the legal injection, like if they
Oh.
I didn't
harm
even
the
consider
organs.
that.
Yeah.
That's, yeah, I feel like that's a very real possibility.
Because it would go through the bloodstream, would it not? Mm-hmm. You would
For
think.
sure.
What is it? They inject potassium and something else in.
Couldn't tell
And then
you. But that would make the most sense. I could see that.
yeah, that's the only reason I can think of. But if any of our listeners know, we would love to be educated on that.
Yes, please.
Okay, so the poem that was his last kind of statement goes, out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeoning of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
It's a pretty nice poem, but now no one will ever be able to look at it the same thanks to this guy.
Yeah, because it's kind of like, F you, government. You can't control me. I stand behind my, like, I will never bow before any man kind of thing, right? That was my interpretation. But yeah, I was like, all right, way to just middle fingers to the government, I guess. And so Terry Nichols, he lost a number of appeals. And then in 2004, he went to trial for the state charges, which included the 161 deaths. So he was actually charged and tried for the 161 deaths of the remaining people who were killed from the bombing. And the jury convicted him on all charges, including conspiracy and arson charges. And they couldn't agree on giving him the death penalty. So again, life without parole. And then in 2004, yeah, he had received 161 consecutive death sentences without the possibility of parole for the remaining people who were killed.
I can't understand why they wouldn't wait to also prosecute McVeigh at the same time as Nichols. Like, instead of just doing the federal trial and then killing him right away, why shouldn't he rot in prison for a few years, then be convicted of 161 people's deaths, and then get the death penalty? Like, what would the difference of a few years have been?
Exactly, because it's not like he's going to somehow get out, and the family of the victims who had passed away from the bombing would probably feel a little bit more closure knowing that he was charged with the deaths of their family members, right? But I don't understand. And so the trial only took like 2 months, which is bonkers because the FBI investigation had conducted more than 28,000 interviews. They had followed more than 43,000 investigative leads. They had collected more than 3 tons of evidence with almost 1 billion pieces of information. They had searched more than 13.2 million hotel registration records, reviewed more than 3.1 million truck rental records, and searched more than 682,000 airline reservation records, trying to like solve this investigation, which is bonkers to me that it was solved within 2 days after they had conducted like all of these interviews and stuff. Because you'd have to have every single FBI officer on the ground kind of thing, like working this case.
That's what I was wondering. Like, how did they find him in 2 days? Yet they had 28,000 interviews. Like,
right?
That must have been a big team of investigators. Oh my God.
Yeah. So that is all I have about the Oklahoma City bombing. It was really, really weird to research and read about what kind of drove Timothy McVeigh to actually doing this. Mm-hmm. But I have many questions for both the FBI and McVeigh that will never get answered. But I have them nonetheless.
Manifest. We'll put them out in the air and then manifest, exactly. And then one day we'll know.
Maybe we could ask Terry Nichols, because I'm pretty sure he's still alive.
Now that would be fun.
Right.
A little side project right to them. Mm-hmm. Side note, related. Remember when we were working with Stinson with that case in Nova Scotia, the murder case, and we were talking about like writing to him in jail? Do you guys remember that? Mm-hmm. We should not write to him, but that would be like, what the forensics? Like, to this guy. Get a hold of him, ask our questions.
We could do like a little like extra where we read stories from prison inmates.
Oh my gosh. Get their side of things. Probably not at all what anyone wants to hear. Like,
yeah, I don't know if that's enabling, but
yeah. Like, yeah. You know what I mean.
Because what's that website? What is it, like inmateconnect.com or something?
Yeah, like it's literally like a dating app for inmates, but it gives you all of their like content.
Pen pal info, basically.
Yeah. It's like what jail they're at, what they're in for, how old they are, like how long they have left until parole.
Yeah. Okay, well, listeners, let us know if you want us to be pen pals with some prison inmates, and we can start a little extra.
Maybe we won't start with like the murderers to begin with. We'll start light with like the
we can see if we can find
chargers.
Like, falsely confused or falsely.
Would it say falsely convicted though?
No, but maybe we can find someone that we think has been falsely convicted.
Do our own research. This is okay. Food for thought. We'll keep this. We'll keep thinking about this. Well, thank you for sharing that. I definitely did not know any of that going into that educational spiel. And to learn more, because I also don't know much about domestic terrorism aside from what we see on Criminal Minds, I would like to pass the mic off to Rebecca to tell us a little bit more.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you, Journey, for telling us all about that, because there are definitely some points where I can see the Oklahoma City bomber fitting into the typologies I'm going to talk about. So just to start off, although there are technically there's 3 broad types of terrorism, but I've only really heard of the 2, and it seems like these 2 are the most commonly spoken about. So even though there is international and domestic terrorism, we're just going to be speaking only about domestic today, as both of these topics on their own are very big and complex with very different statistics. But if anyone's interested in a general terrorism topic in the future, then I'm sure we could look into doing that as well. So countries and their respective governments often have kind of varying definitions of terrorism, just based on how they interpret their own laws and crimes and stuff like that. But according to the FBI, domestic terrorism is violent criminal acts that are committed by an individual or a group to promote their ideological goals, which could be motivated by various influences, including political, religious, social, racial, or environmental. And then, according to Canada's criminal code, terrorism is defined as an act committed, quote, in whole or in part for a political, religious, or ideological purpose, objective, or cause, with the intention of intimidating the public. And then with regard to its security, including its economic security or compelling a person, a government, or a domestic or international organization to do or refrain from doing an act. So Basically, according to the US and Canadian governments, terrorism is an act, a violent act committed by someone with a specific ideology. And they commit these violent acts because they want to basically strike fear and force change on the government by making people so afraid of their ideologies that they feel like they need to submit to it, basically. And while both international and domestic terrorism can be defined in very similar ways, it's important to note the biggest difference in them, which also makes them different. And this is that domestic terrorism applies to those who commit terrorist acts against their own country and are not associated with foreign terrorist organizations. So, for example, ISIS would be considered a foreign terrorist organization. And if someone committed a terrorist act on behalf of ISIS in the United States, it would probably be considered international terrorism because of their associations. So a further definition of terrorism, because there's never enough definitions by different entities, is by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And they state that the crime must appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. So the U.S. Department of Homeland Security basically just goes further into the motives of what makes something, say, a terrorist crime versus a hate crime or any other type. And it seems like within the past couple of decades, talk about domestic terrorism has increased sort of around the same way as the discussion surrounding gun violence in the United States has increased. And despite this, many governments, Canada and the United States included, don't actually have laws that specifically target domestic terrorism. And it's only within the past few years that governments are actually attempting to make government reform to target these more directly. So instead of being charged with terrorism, domestic terrorists in the States and Canada up to present day have often been charged with other offenses related to their crimes, such as murder or unlawful gun ownership. And as we saw with the Oklahoma City bomber, he was charged with the murders of 11 federal employees. But nowhere in the sentencing or in the report does it mention that he was a terrorist of any kind. So this makes it tricky to definitively define a criminal as a domestic terrorist, just because we don't have an exact legal definition of what constitutes domestic terrorism. And because the definition is still relatively general, depending on who interprets the crime that's happening at hand, it could be perceived differently. So, for example, there's a lot of school shootings right now in the United States that some people state are terrorist crimes and some people don't. I personally don't understand how any school shooting would not be a terrorist crime. But yeah, basically there's different violent crimes that, depending on your own opinion on the ideology they're following, you may or may not consider something terrorist that someone else might. So, as mentioned earlier, there are various ideological reasons that a domestic terrorist may want to commit a terrorist act, and they can act either alone or as part of an organization, which I'm going to get into a little bit deeper with the typologies. So in November of 2020, in an attempt to further understand domestic terrorism, the FBI and DHS, so Department of Homeland Security, began working on standardized definitions and methodologies relating to domestic terrorism. And through this process, they've identified a set of five broad categories that domestic terrorists could fall under, each of which are defined by their ideological motivation for the crime. So I'm just going to read like a really brief description of each of the groups of terrorists that they had determined. But all of these is with the preface that they are committing violent acts as a result of the definition provided. So the first group was racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, and they hold ideological agendas that derive from biases related to race or ethnicity, in which the actor or perpetrator uses political and religious justification to support their objectives and criminal activity. And then there's anti-government or anti-authority violent extremism, which I would argue the Oklahoma bomber falls under. And this is ideological agendas derived from anti-government and or anti-authority sentiments, which include opposition to perceived economic, social, or racial hierarchies, perceived government overreach, negligence, or illegitimacy. The third one is animal rights and environmental violent extremism. And this one is ideological agendas from those seeking to end or mitigate perceived cruelty, harm, or exploitation of animals and or the perceived exploitation or destruction of natural resources in the environment. The fourth one, and I apologize in advance that there are a couple words that are not going to sound like words anymore at the end of this episode because they're very frequent. But the fourth one was abortion-related violent extremism. And this one is the ideological agendas relating to abortion, including individuals who advocate for violence, either in support of either pro-life or pro-choice beliefs. So in recent years, there has been a couple attacks on, for example, Planned Parenthood buildings in the United States. So those people would be considered abortion-related violent extremists for the pro-life movement. And then finally, their final typology of domestic terrorist is pretty much a catch-all. Actually, that's exactly what it is. It is all other domestic terrorism threats. And this is the ideological agendas, which are not defined under the previous four categories. And they had stated that these can include agendas flowing from personal grievances and beliefs, such as biases relating to religion, gender, and sexual orientation. When this article was written and when these were created, I think it was around 2020. And I think with how fast the political climate is moving, I think even today they would have an additional one just because if you have been on Twitter in the past year, you would see a lot of not great things towards the LGBTQ community. And I would say that we are getting close to having to add a fifth category. But as of the time this was written, the terrorist attacks towards the LGBT community would fall under all other domestic terrorism threats.
So with the abortion-related violent extremism, what differentiates that from like the racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism? Because they're using like religious justifications also in abortion ones.
I think the difference between those is that the people that fall into racially or ethnically motivated extremism, at least to my own understanding, these are the people that would fall more so under like the KKK, for example. Like they're using the religion to justify hatred towards people of color. Whereas the abortion related stuff, yes, that could be related to their religion, but it could also be related to a number of other things that aren't race related. Yeah, they didn't. I was surprised for an FBI document how little they actually provided on each of these. But yeah, basically racially or ethnically motivated with regards to religious justification falls only under if they're discriminating or being violent towards other races just because they say, oh, the Bible says be mean to these people. Even though I know that's not true, but that's how they'll justify it. An abortion related could be related to religion, but it's not racially motivated.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I just missed that it was like specifically like racial and ethnic. And then I just focused on like the religious part of it.
That's fair. The definitions do get pretty repetitive, so it's understandable how they can kind of just muddle together.
Yeah.
I think with like the abortion ones too, it's more broad in a sense compared to the racial and ethnic, in that like people who see it in other realms that aren't religiously motivated could like are still going to fall under that. You know what I mean? Like if someone goes to commit heinous things on a Planned Parenthood, they very well could just be like, well, I love all lives. Like I wouldn't see really that as like a racial motivation or like a religious. Like I feel like there's a lot of things that could impact how someone could be biased towards something like that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Or it could be something like in one of the FBI documents I was reading, or CSIS documents, it actually mentioned that the incel movement some of the more serious people of this movement could fall under one of these domestic terrorist categories, such as Alec Manassian, who ran the van into a group of people on Yonge Street. He was motivated by that movement. I can't remember the name of the other guy right now, but was also same thing. He was a mass shooter, and he was very big in this movement to the point where a lot of people in the incel community began hailing him as a hero for what he did to the victims. So it could even, in terms of the abortion related, be something, unfortunately, as simple as them just really hating women, not wanting them to have rights. So they're going to take it out on everyone in this building, which is probably going to be majority women. But moving on from that, Canada's security and government entities don't have such a detailed list of domestic terrorist categories as this. Like, they don't break it down into like specific types of hate crime, I suppose you could say. However, there has been research conducted by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, regarding the frequency of domestic terrorism, in which they've came up with categories as well that they deemed right-wing, left-wing, and religious terrorism, which I will preface has nothing to do with the political viewpoints of people in government. They just chose right wing and left wing based on the types of ideas, I guess. I'll get into that in a second. But in the study that was published by CSIS, by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in 2020, they analyzed data from between 1994 and 2020 of domestic terror attacks in the United States. Not positive why CSIS is doing studies for the United States, but that's beside the point. Did research 1994 and 2020 of domestic terror attacks in the United States to identify the common themes or ideologies behind the attacks, as well as the types of weapons or violence involved. So CSIS divided the data into 4 categories, of which they stated, like I said before, despite the names, have no correspondence with the political parties in the United States. These terms are simply used to generalize between types of terrorism. So the 4 categories are right-wing terrorism, which includes racial or ethnic supremacy, opposition to government authority, anger at women, e.g. the incel movement, and outrage against certain policies, such as abortion. Left-wing terrorism includes those terrorists that oppose capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism, advocate Black nationalism, pursue environmental or animal rights issues, espouse pro-communist or pro-socialist beliefs, or support a decentralized social and political system such as anarchism. The third one was religious terrorism, which was violence in support of a faith-based belief system such as Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Hinduism. And then finally was the least common, to the point where they didn't even really give statistics on this group, was ethno-nationalist terrorism. And this is in support of ethnic or nationalist goals, which often include struggles of self-determination and separation along ethnic or national lines. I didn't completely understand that one, I'm gonna be honest. But at the same time, it did amount for a very small amount of the overall domestic terrorism between these 2 decades. So I'm just going to get a little bit into the statistics of the prior 3.
Would the ethno-nationalist terrorism be like someone in the United States who identifies strongly with the views of ISIS then commits domestic terrorist acts kind of to prove their support of ISIS?
I think so.
That's kind of what would make sense to me.
Yeah, that's the only way that I really understood it as well. I think that's a safe bet. I don't want to say for sure that that's what it was, only because the sources I read talking about how if they're associated with a foreign terrorist entity, then it's not domestic terrorism. But what if they were born and raised in the US and still doing it on behalf? Like, I think there's a lot of gray lines that we're all trying to figure out still.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, so yes.
I don't know if this is going to help at all because I'm still a little confused about it, but just a quick, what is ethno-nationalism? It says that it's some types of ethnic nationalism are firmly rooted in the idea of ethnicity as an inherited characteristic. So, for example, Black nationalism or white nationalism, often ethnic nationalism, often manifests in the assimilation of minority ethnic groups into the dominant group. For example, with the Italianization. Didn't know that was a thing. But yeah, I guess that would be the sense of like a minor ethnic group into dominant groups. So like I can see where you're kind of coming from, Journey, maybe.
So with that definition then, would it be like when you live, like the argument of like different religions within Canada? Like there's a certain, I think it's Islamic religion where they have a religious knife that they want to wear, but like defense weapons aren't allowed in Canada. And so it's hard to find the line between like, is that knife a defense weapon or a religious thing? And so saying no to them carrying that would be a form of like ethno-nationalism kind of thing, because you were kind of like assimilating them into like Canadian culture, whatever that might be.
Just for a little knowledge, the ones who carry around the I forget what it's called, but it has a specific name. But it's Sikhism that carries the sheath.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I couldn't remember what their actual name was, and I didn't want to offend anybody. But yeah, that was kind of my.
It's called a. I also just looked it up. I'm sorry. It's called a kirpan. That's what it's called. Okay. It's it's just a ceremonial knife worn by them, basically.
Right.
Some ethno-nationalism examples, I guess, to paint idea of like groupings. It says in Western Europe, there's Irish, Germans, Danish, Finns. In Eastern Europe, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians. I don't know if this helps. In Asia, Turks, Georgians, Armenians, Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, Thai, Burmese. So like, I guess just groupings.
That just sounds like, like an ethnic grouping.
Please,
and
listeners,
then you kind of like
us.
commit terrorism based on your heritage. So like, would then like colonialism, or is that a separate? I feel like
it took up such a small percentage, though, that I feel like colonialism, that would be large. You would see that on the statistics.
Right?
Yeah, as of right now, I'm just not sure the difference between.
And this stuff coming up online is very muddy between like what ethno-nationalist terrorism is with what like other types of terrorism is too. Like it's a very fluid result.
Yeah, I wonder if like white supremacy, in terms of CSIS's definitions, if white supremacy would fall under ethno-nationalism, but under the FBI's definitions, if it would fall under racially or ethnically motivated. Because like all of them overlap in some way. There's just like different categories for them. So I guess maybe the KKK would be ethno-nationalist.
Listeners, educate us.
I don't know if the KKK would be, because aren't they religiously based?
That's a great question.
I don't know. Because I guess they are white supremacists.
Do a KKK episode. Would that be extreme?
We should do that. That would be very interesting.
I think that would be cool.
Really interesting.
Because there is a lot with that.
It would be really interesting to do that and then discuss why they're not considered a terrorist group yet.
Ooh.
Because
technically, I believe they are. I am actually going to get into not the KKK in particular, but I'm going to get into kind of why the KKK can still exist in groups like that. And it has very much to do with their First Amendment rights.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, we'll let you continue, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll kind of skip this point that I had here because we just spoke about it. But as you can see, there's a lot of overlap between CSIS's categories and the FBI DHS's categories. And it's going to be the same thing. Like if you look, I'm sure Interpol probably has categories for it, or the UK has categories. Like, because we don't standardize across the globe, we're going to have a lot of overlap when in kind of how everybody sees domestic terrorism. But yeah, just going into statistics and data a little bit from the CSIS report I was talking about. So as I said, even though it's made by CSIS, it's on data in the United States between 1994 and 2020. So across right and left wing terrorism acts, left and right wing and religious terrorism acts between 1994 and 2020, it was found that firearms were the most frequently used weapon during lethal attacks. However, across all attacks, fatal and non-fatal, explosives and incendiaries were the most often used weapon. So this would be what the Oklahoma City bomber used, was a bomb. But then incendiaries are things that can cause a fire or explosion. So the most common example I saw of an incendiary was like a Molotov cocktail.
Okay, I was gonna ask. I was like, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, it's something that I'm not sure if I could say a grenade is an incendiary, but basically it's something that like you can throw or put down and it starts something else. That's my understanding.
Be considered an incendiary if you use it in like a malicious context?
I feel like probably.
I don't see why not.
4th of July was this week, I feel like.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't see why not.
Okay.
It could cause fire.
Yeah, right? Anyway.
But yeah, further, it was found that between the study review period, there were 411 right-wing terrorist attacks, 219 left-wing terrorist attacks, and the amount of religious attacks was unclear due to a lot of the data, due to a lack of data for about 2 or 3 years during the review period, and I don't know where the lack came from. However, they did find that the most frequently targeted group across all terrorist groups were government, military, and police facilities and personnel, which made up 43% of all religious attacks between 1994 and 2020. And in terms of fatal attacks... Oh,
sorry to interrupt, but don't you think that if you were constantly being like the target of a terrorist attack, wouldn't you kind of maybe like take a second and think, oh... what am I doing that's causing... Yeah, like, not to side with the terrorists, but, like, I think I would maybe do some, like, self-reflection.
They've got other things that are more important, like having multiple shows with cops in it that they have to provide insight on, you know?
I don't know.
They can't be bothered with protection on terrorism. No.
Yeah, I don't know. Just a question.
One thing I found interesting, too, with what you said, like, that, if I call it that right, that the religious terrorism targets police states, like police and whatnot. Yeah. I'm shocked that they're not, like, I don't know. My mind would go to, like, targeting other religious movement or like other religious movements or buildings or like something that doesn't align with their religious belief. Like, I would think other things would fall into that before law enforcement, you know?
Definitely.
So
yeah.
It's very interesting to see that that's the main places.
Absolutely. And they did, like, it was an average of 43% that religious terrorist attacks happen between government, military, and police. But then there is still almost 60% that can obviously kind of account for like attacks on other religious groups and women's centers and schools and all of these things. In the links, I have or in the sources, I have links to all of the reports that I read, and they have very nice, beautiful, organized, colorful charts that show you all of the information that I'm sharing now in more detail. So definitely check those out. But yeah, big takeaway from this is that terrorists are not a fan of government, military, and police. So then just some more statistics in terms of fatal attacks. So this only accompanies terrorist attacks that ended in casualties, at least one or more casualties. They found that in right-wing attacks, and just going back really quick, remember right and left-wing are not talking about the political spectrum. We're talking about a broad group of ideologies. Okay, so firearms were responsible for 73% of all fatal right-wing attacks. They were responsible for 100% of all fatal left-wing attacks and 62% of all fatal religious attacks. So long story short, there is guns and terrorists do not mix well.
That's a fair, yeah.
I can't believe
I back
that
up that.
Yeah, I can't believe that they're like 100% of left-wing attacks that were fatal.
I'm, again, not supporting terrorists in the slightest, but you'd think they'd be better at making bombs.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
But like, why?
I'm very glad they're not.
You don't have to think too hard to use a gun, though, right? Like, and they're so widely accessible in the United States, too.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Like, it's frightening. Well, like you were saying, and I know McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombing was before 9/11. So this was before the time that there's like metal detectors in every American school and stuff like that. But still the fact that he felt comfortable enough underage to just go to school with a gun.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, and no one thought twice about that.
Yeah. Like if anyone under 18 in Canada was caught with a gun, like whoever's legally responsible for them would be jailed.
Yeah.
I would hope, at least.
Yeah, especially like without a gun license, specifically in Canada. Like if you have a gun without a gun license, like see you later. That's insane. Yeah. That statistic is crazy.
It is. I didn't expect it to be that high. When I was researching, I did genuinely believe that explosives would account for most of the issues, but I guess that's just me stereotyping terrorist attacks, which is not good on my part, but I'm sure I'm not the only one. And now I know more. That's why we learn. But moving on from the typologies and a little bit of scary statistics, what can be done or is being done to prevent domestic terrorism, or at least to prosecute those who have already committed these acts? So in terms of preventing domestic terrorism, surprisingly, it might be more difficult to do than preventing international terrorism, at least in the United States. I was a little surprised when I read this because I assumed if it was domestic, it'd be easier just because it's happening on your own soil. However, for example, in the United States, the federal government has many resources at their disposal that they can use to combat international terrorism, almost all of which falls under the Patriot Act, which, if you remember last episode, is also the act in which Snowden was charged for espionage under. But under the Patriot Act, the government has the authority to conduct surveillance on suspected terrorists, obtain financial records, and conduct undercover sting operations, all if the person is suspected of being involved in international terrorism, which ultimately can help prevent future attacks if they're successful. However, many of these international terrorism operations, which are conducted under the Patriot Act, are done based on ideologies that the suspects hold and express, even if they haven't outright committed a crime yet. So if a citizen of the United States on United States soil spouted ideologies that were seen as hateful or radical, but hasn't acted on them yet, they're largely protected under the First Amendment, which protects free speech, and thus the government can't conduct the same sort of surveillance or operations as if they were international. And it's because their citizens, until they commit a crime, are, as I just said, I suppose, it doesn't matter how hateful their speech is. If they are not directly threatening someone or actively committing a crime, yes, they are protected from the government for their free speech, but they're not protected from consequences, but they are from the government, if that makes sense. There's a little bit of a tangent there. Yes, basically, private companies can kind of give you consequences if you say something they don't like, but the government, if you say something they don't like, they can't do anything until you commit a crime, which I guess is fair and it's protected, but there needs to be something more done for people who are actively spreading these ideologies and acting on them, because we're acting on them too late at that point.
Well, and I feel like a lot of people can be spreading these ideologies and then other people will be reading them and then acting on them. So I feel like the person who acted on that ideology needs to be punished, but also the person who started like spreading that misinformation and ideology should also have some sort of like disciplinary action.
I agree. And I hope change comes to that. But just like all of the fights and civil unrest happening with, sorry, I blanked on the Second Amendment and reforming gun laws, I think there would arguably be an even bigger uproar trying to implement something on the First Amendment to prevent domestic terrorism.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. But in a statement that was given by Brad Weijman, I apologize if I'm saying that wrong. He is or was, I'm not positive if he's still active, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the U.S. Department of Justice. He gave a statement at a hearing titled Confronting the Rise of Domestic Terrorism in the Homeland in 2019 in front of the Department of Homeland Security. And in this, he said, quote, "In fighting domestic terrorism, we respect the constitutional rights of freedom of speech, association, and assembly of all Americans. The FBI opens cases on suspected criminal violations, not ideologies. The FBI may not investigate solely on the basis of First Amendment protected activity," unquote. So I'd say in that sentence alone is the reason that we're so much better at preventing international than domestic terrorism. But with that being said, I'm not saying it's only that quote. It's everything that this quote comes from is essentially the reason that groups such as the KKK are still allowed to operate today. It's because people can openly be members of the KKK. For an example, there are plenty of other groups that are like this, that are like pseudo-terrorist, basically in the eyes of the states. But people can openly be members of it and spew hateful ideology. But unless the government has a reasonable suspicion that a member is planning on or has already committed a crime, they legally just can't do anything about the activity behavior. And they essentially have to let them continue spreading these harmful ideas because it's technically protected, even though it is harming millions of people worldwide.
Is there no
country
amendment about like hate speech?
I don't know enough about the First Amendment to speak on that. I know hate speech is a crime, at least in Canada, which is what confuses me so much about this specifically.
Because I understand like the importance of freedom of speech, but I also think that there should be a line drawn of what becomes hate speech.
I think that line is very fuzzy. Like, I do believe there is a line, obviously. Like, there has to be, I would hope. But I think the circumstances surrounding what is and what isn't very fine line, unfortunately.
Really briefly, I looked up hate speech USA, and just from this Wikipedia page, first sentence, I suppose I'll cite the Wikipedia page because I'm going to directly quote it right now. But it answers our question. It says, quote, hate speech in the United States cannot be directly regulated by the government due to the fundamental right to freedom of speech protected by the Constitution. While hate speech is not a legal term in the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that most of what would qualify as hate speech in other Western countries is legally protected speech under the First Amendment. Unquote.
All right. Well, that does answer our questions.
That's honestly really gross.
I know, I have so many feelings.
Yeah. If they didn't protect hate speech, maybe they could do more about domestic terrorism. What?
Well, from your mouth to God's ears, so. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but moving on from that, because I suppose I should stop bad-mouthing their government.
Opening up a new can of worms for us to respond to later.
At least we can't get charged with hate speech. It's just freedom of speech. They can't get us.
And
that's very true.
Fuck the
That's
states.
very true.
The Canadian government can get us, but we're safe from the states.
Yeah. They have other things to worry about. They're not going to come after the three of us.
Exactly.
Oh, very true. But yeah, just speaking over all of that and kind of the lack of, I guess, what they're doing to prevent domestic terrorism, it becomes very clear that change is needed in how we currently handle domestic terrorism. And it's becoming more evident with each passing year. So in another study that was conducted by CSIS on domestic terrorism in the United States between 1994 and 2021, so it might actually be the same report, or same data set written in a different report. All the articles blended together. But they found that out of all of their data of all the years, 2021 had the highest recorded number of domestic terrorism to date. And in 2021 alone, there were 73 domestic terror attacks and plots in the United States.
Can I hypothesize why?
Yes.
Because COVID, and people are spending way too much time home alone, ruminating with their thoughts, seeing all this crap online about stuff, and they go, yeah, I know what I believe in. Boom, domestic terrorism increase.
COVID was actually something they did mention in the article, because from 2014, domestic terrorism has been steadily increasing in the United States, but in 2020, it kind of dropped a little bit. And then in 2021, skyrocketed again. So they suspect that COVID-19, basically because everyone was stuck indoors, no one could actually go out and commit these crimes. But now that it's over, everything is just picked up, and we're still on the increase we've been seeing since mid-2010s.
True. Wow. I guess if you're stuck inside, you can't do much. But once those restrictions lift, then
yeah,
exactly.
Did the articles say why they chose 1994 as the starting year?
Not that I found, but I suspect it has something to do with how data was collected. Because one of the things they did mention in this report were ways that they could possibly reform the government and reform on improving basically how they respond. And they did say that there needs to be an effort to have more detailed data analysis and data collection. Same with, as I said, for some reason, I think it was between 1996 and 98, there was no data for religious terrorism in the United States, which is why they couldn't give a definitive how many fatal attacks and how many non-fatal.
Right.
But yeah, it's just weird. There was missing data. And I think they really need to improve kind of how we're dealing with data collection.
Yeah, definitely.
But of the 73 attacks that happened in 2021 in the States, there was a total of 30 casualties, with an average of 31 casualties happening per year between 2014 and 2021. And just for comparison, between 1994 and 2013, so a much larger time period, there were only 3 years in that time span where the number of casualties resulting from domestic terrorism exceeded 8 individuals. And then between 2014 and 2021, we averaged 31 per year.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so it's definitely increasing. And then
probably Timothy McVeigh then skews the numbers, or is one of the 3 events or whatever. Because
he definitely would have been one of the outliers.
Mm-hmm. And they don't include. Sorry to interrupt you again.
Okay. It's okay.
They don't include school shootings as domestic terrorism, right?
That I'm not completely sure about.
Okay.
I know they don't include certain hate crimes because I was reading through it and they only included violent hate crimes, which removed a lot of hate crimes.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, in terms of whether or not they classified school shootings as domestic terrorism, I'm not positive. I'd have to go through it and again and look for it. But I'll let you know if I do end up figuring that out.
Yeah.
But also of the 73 attacks that had occurred in 2021, they found that 38 were committed by white supremacy and like-minded ideologic groups or individuals, and 31 of them were committed by anarchist or anti-fascist like-minded ideologic individuals. And additionally, they found that regardless of the perpetrator's ideology, so they could be right-wing, left-wing, religious, ethnoculture, or ethno-nationalist, they found that government, military, and police locations and personnel were always the most frequently targeted group. So in order to combat domestic terrorism, a lot of work and reform, as we've spoken about, is still needed. And while there is work being done, which includes the announcement made by President Joe Biden in 2021, which announced the US's first national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, many organizations and people are calling for more action to be taken on the individuals and groups who use digital platforms to spread their harmful ideologies, as research has found that many of the modern domestic terrorists that we've seen in recent years use the internet and social media to release propaganda, fundraise for their cause, recruit and communicate with new and old members of their groups, and also to organize terrorist plots against other groups of people. So while it is an issue of free speech in America that's holding back the progress on stopping domestic terrorism, something also needs to be done about the groups that are seemingly spreading these harmful ideas without legal consequence. As you guys were saying earlier, how there should be consequence not only for the perpetrator, but the person that's been spreading these lies to them. And I guess we kind of saw that with Alex Jones. I know that was for defamation, but he did inadvertently cause a lot of people, or at least influenced a lot of people to believe this very not good misinformation that resulted in a lot of victims' families being like terrorized by people thinking they know the truth.
Well, even just like the sheer amount of misinformation being spread about every single thing on the internet these days is like unbelievable.
Oh, well, it's hard to know what's right and what's not.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
But I'm kind of wrapping up here now, but just with regards to international terrorism, there seems to be a lot more being done to stop it right now. And this is in large part due to the 9/11 terrorist attacks of New York. Thankfully, governments have recognized the need to up their measures on combating domestic terrorism in recent years because it has become more prevalent in recent decades. So one way in which CSIS has noted to improve would be, again, as we mentioned earlier, so I'm kind of just reiterating now, would be to implement better and more rigorous data collection and analysis, which can be used alongside terrorism countermeasures we presently have to reduce the threat of domestic terrorism. And then they also recognize the need to update counterterrorism training and resource programs to ensure that there's ample resources for understanding, detecting, deterring, and investigating acts of domestic terrorism with respect to like newer technological advancements, such as like social media, for example, and also across all levels of law enforcement instead of just federal. I briefly mentioned earlier Biden's announcement about the new counterterrorism program. So the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism is aiding in the effort to increase these resources that CSIS is calling for, as well as they're promoting cross-agency coordination and collaboration to ensure that all of the relative information or potentially relative information is being utilized by the right people to prevent terrorism attacks. So, for example, the FBI or like a state police officer might have received information that could have been vital to a terrorist attack 2 states over, but they don't usually cooperate. So how are they going to know if this can help? So basically, they're just trying to kind of synchronize all of the departments a little more in hopes that they can solve some more crimes. And I'm sure that's going to help with more than just domestic terrorism, but domestic terrorism is the main goal they have in mind right now. So then additionally, law enforcement can work with non-law enforcement agencies or entities such as financial institutions, which can identify instances of potential terrorist financing. And although this is done pretty much only right now, I believe, for international terrorism, same thing as we're seeing with kind of editing or altering international terrorism protocols for domestic. With the proper protocols, typologies, and research, I feel like this could be another useful tool in fighting domestic terrorism as well as international. But the bottom line is that domestic terrorism is just like international in the sense that it's a violent activity conducted by someone with an ideological motive in order to spread fear and intimidate populations. With the only difference being that one of them occurs by a citizen to their own country and the other occurs by an individual to someone else's country. They're basically equally as dangerous because all violent crime is violent crime. It doesn't matter what you're motivated by. If it's hate, it's all the same. There's no single ideology that's responsible for domestic terrorism, and it can be perpetrated by a single person, such as I guess the Oklahoma City bomber did have a partner, but a single individual, such as Quebec's École Polytechnique mass shooting in 1989, who was motivated by his sheer hatred for women. But they can also be orchestrated as part of a larger terrorist group, such as, like we described, the KKK. Or if we're talking international, then we could also talk like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are also large terrorist groups. But that's all I really have on domestic terrorism without getting too much into its overlap between international. I did put a fun little website. It's not fun because it's really sad statistics. I put an interesting website just on my next slide that has like an interactive, a bunch of interactive charts for like worldwide terrorism data. If you guys have time to check it out, it'll also be on our website. It's ourworldanddata.org. So just look for that link and it'll bring you to some cool stuff. But yeah, that's all I've got for us today.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that. I had a question that came up. My brain pondered this as you were talking, Rebecca. But with all of the current events that are going on with the shit hitting the fan in the world everywhere and like the protests in France, have you guys heard about that, by the way? The French
No, I haven't
protests?
heard anything about that.
Oh, the French are going crazy right now. I think, I don't know the full details, but I believe a young black male was killed by police. And so, rightfully so, shit's hitting the fan.
Yeah.
But my question then was, could protesters, in a sense, could they be seen as domestic terrorism if it escalates to a certain point? Because like the definition in itself is like a person or group committing violent criminal acts to promote ideological goals. So if they're all having the same goal to make change, but peaceful protests aren't always a thing. Like, if they get too violent, could that then blur the line between domestic terrorism and protest? What do you guys think?
I think that's like exactly where the lines become too gray for what we currently understand.
Yeah.
Like through my research, I couldn't get out of my head. And now I am kind of talking about political spectrum, not left and white terrorism.
Yeah.
But looking at, like, if you think about left-wing, air quotation, individuals who were in support of Black Lives Matter movements, some of those did become violent. And so people on the right-wing side, many of them are calling them Antifa terrorists and all of this stuff. But then if we look at, on the other side, the January 6th riots that occurred, a lot of people are also considering those terrorist attacks. But then the group of people who support it are saying that it was a protest into the you know what it was about. It was everywhere. But basically it's the same idea that the reason the States isn't really prosecuting hate speech right now is because what's hate speech, or like what's a really hateful ideology to one person, is not going to be seen as a hateful ideology to another person. And so, yeah, like not everyone sees certain acts as terrorism the same as others would. And I think we really need like a standardized definition to be able to decide that right now.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, because I wouldn't consider like the Black Lives Matter movement and the riots associated with that as domestic terrorism, but I would definitely consider like the January 6th incident as terrorism. But again, it's like whatever aligns with your political beliefs that kind of shapes your judgment of what is or isn't a terrorist attack.
Exactly, which is what makes it so difficult to decide on protocols and definitions and typologies.
Because especially too, like if we look at that, then it's the people who are in charge. It's basically their ideologies and beliefs that are dictating what is and what is not terrorism. You know what I mean? Like it's not a collective. Anyways, gray area. But food for thought. I wanted to get your opinion on it. Well, thank you to the both of you for enlightening me and the listeners about all things Oklahoma City bombing and domestic terrorism. So thank you for that. Our next episode, we're kind of going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to focus on two ongoing cases at the moment. So this is the case of Lori Vallow, and then the case of Jonathan Majors. So keep your eyes peeled for that episode. And my fun little tidbit, forensic, not Friday information. They've done a forensic facial reconstruction of a teenager in the 7th century. So they've got a exhibition on right now at the University of Cambridge's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. That sounds like an incredible place to visit. Would love to go to that.
Me too. I'm like, I need to add that to my list of places to go.
Yeah. But then too, like their exhibition is called Beneath Our Feet, Archaeology of the Cambridge Region. So it's just everything found in that region, which is super old in and of itself. But basically what happened is they found this very odd grave back in 2012, I believe it was, they found it. They found the remains of about a 16-year-old girl. She was buried in a carved wooden bed. And this was unique because this was one of only about 18 ever found in the United Kingdom. I don't know what the bed symbolizes, don't know what that means, but that was cool. She was wearing gold pins, fine clothing. She had a beautiful ornate cross around her neck. And this has been called the Trumpington Cross by researchers just because of the location where it was found in. But basically, the reason why they did this facial reconstruction was to like make it more of a personable experience. So they thought that museum goers, if they were to go to this museum and they could see this face of this 16-year-old 7th century English girl looking at you, then you could like resonate with it a bit more and like really kind of understand it a bit better. And the researchers were saying too, like for them, it was really neat in their perspective, because after spending so much time researching something and like devoting your research to this individual, you finally give them a face. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. That's
So
actually
there's
so
many
cool.
so many archaeologists don't get that opportunity. Like that's super cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this what was he? A forensic artist, I believe his name, I have it somewhere. Hugh Morrison. He was a forensic artist. He reconstructed this teenager. He did have to guess eye and hair color, just because that's not something we can see with facial markers and all of that. But he did notice that apparently one of her eyes sat lower than the other. So that was a big feature that they portrayed in this reconstruction of them.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's neat to see kind of like that forensic application outside of, I mean, in the same way, yeah, you're putting a face to a victim of some sort. I mean, she may not have been a victim. We don't know the circumstances yet. But yeah, I'll link the article too, because it was really neat to read about. And the cross that she was wearing is insane. Like, let me see if I can find.
I can't wait to see pictures. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That kind
is
of looks like
wild.
a Knights Templars type cross.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then they also conducted isotopic analysis. I don't know if we ever talked about that in any of our episodes. I feel like it may have come up once in a while.
I feel like we've like glanced over it, but it hasn't been a topic in itself.
A topic. Yeah, okay. So they also conducted those types of analyses, and they found that she was not actually native to England. So she came to England at about 7 years old from, they believe, the Alps. And they also were matches, like the isotopic analysis they conducted matched another woman who was found, two other women who were found also in that area, who were also in beds. So I really don't know the significance of these carved beds, but I really want to learn about it.
Yeah, and given there were so few found in the UK, like leads to believe like those women might have all been related and of some sort of like royalty, you know?
And that's what the big part of this exhibition is trying to showcase, is like women in history and women in these times and like their role and their everything. You know what I mean? Just kind of bringing light to it all. But yeah, they thought maybe aristocratic, maybe a royal status of some sort. But just from the brief Smithsonian article I read, they didn't go too deep into who she may have been.
That is so cool. I'm so intrigued by those beds and the cross that was on her too. Like, that's so cool.
Yeah. So I'm curious to see if more comes out like in the future, combining forensics with archaeology. It's such an interesting discipline.
Right?
So interesting.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. And they have like bioarchaeologists or bio something or other who work with bones, and everything was so cool. But yeah, that's
awesome.
The little extra tidbit on top of that for this episode. If you want to find out more about that, you can check us out on our website. And where else can people find us, Journey?
All right. People can find us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook at What the Forensics. Our Twitter is WT Forensics PC. We're not very active on it, so I would definitely go to either our Instagram or our Facebook if you want to see what we're up to, or our website, which is whattheforensics.ca. And our email is whattheforensics@gmail.com. If you have any like questions, comments, concerns, any topic ideas.
We want to interact with you guys. Please talk to us.
Yeah.
Send us your suggestions. But yeah, give us a review wherever you listen. We like to read them from the few that we've gotten. But
Yeah.
definitely check out our website. I feel like we've put most of our time into our website, and I'm really proud of our website and like just the content that's on it. Like everything's there, from our episodes, our sources, a little bit about us. You know, you hear our voices, you may not see our faces if you're not on socials. So we're on there. And then, stuff like this, like learn about this 7th century teenage girl. You can find the article on our website there. So definitely give us a look there.
And we're trying to like keep up with some like current events of like forensics. So we have the Unabomber died and like what's going on with Paul Bernardo and just like a bunch of other stuff just for your reading pleasure on our website as well.
Yeah.
Basically your one-stop shop for everything forensics.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Great way to put it, Rebecca. And with that, this has been another episode of What the Forensics. We hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time.
Bye. Just a reminder to everyone that we are not professionals in the forensic science field. We are just interested in forensics and want to share what we are learning with our listeners. We're trying to give you the most accurate information, but we are human and can make mistakes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you next week.